The Second Sudanese Civil War began in spring of 1983, when the government in Khartoum violated the Addis Ababa Agreement by trying to redeploy southern Sudanese soldiers to northern Sudan. This was compounded by the subsequent decision to abolish the Southern Sudan Autonomous Region and impose Sharia law on the south in the summer of 1983. Southern Army officer John Garang fled to Ethiopia with his conspirators and several thousand troops, where they began arming and training new fighters in the Sudan People's Liberation Army. But due to the SPLA's popular perception as a Dinka militia, many other southern ethnic groups refused to join up and chose to fight against Khartoum with their own locally organized militias. If you want the full context on that, then watch these two previous videos. Similar to the early years of the First Civil War, the first few years mostly saw infighting amongst the competing sides. Despite funding southern rebels, the Ethiopian government would pit the factions against each other in order to ensure they were all dependent on Ethiopia. The Ethiopian army would arm various Anyanya II groups to attack the SPLA in their camps along the Sudan-Ethiopia border throughout 1984. Of course, the Anyanya II were also fractious, and infighting led to the deaths of several leaders, allowing William Abdallah Kual to merge several factions and continue their fight against Garang. He cut off several routes for supplying new recruits to train at SPLA camps in Ethiopia, along with the supply lines to its forces in Bahr al-Ghazal. Ghaffar Namairi would exploit southern divisions by arming some of the militias against those who were rebelling against Khartoum. He would use their allegiance for propaganda purposes in order to portray the Sudan People's Liberation Movement as only caring about southern interests rather than the welfare of Sudan as a whole. The Sudanese army would clash with SPLA guerrillas along the border with Ethiopia. Some of the tribal militias that initially sided against Garang would realign themselves with the SPLA in order to gain access to weapons and other supplies. The SPLA would encourage members of these groups to receive training at their camps in Ethiopia, which also came with a dose of indoctrination. These efforts led to the SPLA capturing Boma in late 1985, which would become its in-country headquarters, continuing to recruit from the Upper Nile and Bahr al-Ghazal regions. However, the Equatorians remained distrustful of the SPLA, still perceiving them as a Dinka army. As often happens in most African countries, a civil war makes what is often a very poor situation even worse. Tons of Sudanese refugees fled to Ethiopia to escape violence, while tons of Ethiopian refugees fled to Sudan to escape famine. In March of 1985, Vice President George Bush and his wife visited a refugee camp in Sudan on a humanitarian trip delivering aid. Barbara Bush recalled the sad state of affairs in her memoir. On this trip, we visited large refugee camps in Sudan, where they were trying to save the lives of drought victims and refugees from Ethiopia. The newcomers to the camp were so thin and malnourished that it was like looking at x-rays instead of bodies. The civil war in Sudan reveals a growing rift within the Reagan administration. On the one hand, you have the Cold War anti-communist hawks, who see the southern rebels as puppets of Moscow and Gaddafi, while on the other side you have a growing constituency within the Reagan coalition, that being southern evangelicals, who see this fight as Southern Christians fighting for freedom against an Islamic dictatorship. But it became difficult for evangelicals to get their way in the administration when Southern rebels had a habit of kidnapping American missionaries in the region, contributing to the growing hostage crisis of the 1980s. I wish to hell we had forces in the area who could move in. We don't, of course, but I'm fed up with this kind of thing. Relations between the US and Sudan would start growing cold in the spring of 1985, when riots broke out in Khartoum. While fighting engrossed the South, the economy of the North was in dire straits, eventually boiling over into protests in the capital, led by a coalition of professors and activists called the National Alliance for National Salvation. To prevent a breakdown in order, the Sudanese army would launch a coup, removing Namairi from power. In his diary, President Reagan says he believes that Gaddafi was behind the riots, just as he had been supporting the SPLA. And it's not unbelievable considering the interim regime would pivot Sudan's foreign policy in support of both Libya and Iran, which forced the Reagan administration to cut all but bare minimum ties. After the coup, Gaddafi would cut his support for anti-Khartoum rebels. The military replaced Namairi to bring an end to the civil war and reverse the worsening economic crisis. This was partly why they pivoted toward Gaddafi, hoping it would end Libya's support for anti-Khartoum rebels. But the SPLA was hesitant in reopening relations with the regime. Despite supporting the ousting of Namairi, the rest of the government was still filled with his appointees, and they couldn't appease the South by adopting a new secular constitution when the Arabs and Muslims of northern Sudan overwhelmingly supported a state based on Sharia law. Khartoum would offer a ceasefire with the SPLA, but they refused to accept it, or to participate in elections until a constitutional convention could be held, with all parties in attendance. The Ethiopian government hosted a summit at the Coca Dam in March of 1986, in which all of the parties except for the Democratic Union Party and the National Islamic Front participated. The meeting issued a declaration which called for a constitutional convention to discuss a new government as well as numerous cultural and economic issues. It also temporarily suspended religious laws and restored the 1956 constitution until a new one could be ratified. New parliamentary elections were held in April, which were the first open elections since 1968. And despite their refusal to participate in the Coca Dam Conference, the DUP would come in first, winning 100 of Parliament's 260 seats, which led them to forming a coalition government with the Umma Party and the National Islamic Front. Despite being the junior partner, the Umma Party's leader, Sadiq al-Mahdi, would become prime minister. The vote in the south was heavily split, in part due to regions controlled by the SPLA not participating in the election. On top of this, outside parties such as the Umma, DUP, and NIF also poured money to get spoiler candidates elected. After the election, Khartoum would begin talks with Garang and Addis Ababa, where the rebel leaders made it clear he wouldn't accept a ceasefire until the Coca Dam Declaration was fully implemented. Sadiq also refused to give a straight answer on whether he would repeal the September laws. Sadiq al-Mahdi was an ardent Islamist and Arabist, wanting closer ties with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. For years he criticized the Memoir's regime for being insufficiently Islamic, which was part of why he spent so many years in exile. In addition to this, the DUP was anti-federalism, thus opposing regional autonomy, while the NIF, led by Sadiq's cousin Hassan al-Turabi, supported a version of Sharia law that permits the death penalty for apostates, and forces Sharia law on non-Muslims. Since neither the DUP nor NIF had participated in the Coca Dam Conference, neither felt beholden to its declaration. Between this and the general popularity of the September laws in the north, Prime Minister al-Mahdi had little incentive to give into the demands of Southerners. There is no sponsor for this video, but I would like to talk to you guys about my Patreon. And in particular, I would like to thank the newest patrons who have joined since the last video. Nada Simic, Steph, Colin Fogg, God of Door Zero, Kate Dalgleish, What Now Get Now, Ori Alec, Gene Freestone, Mike Rooch.
My crotch! My crotch! Hey, has anybody seen my crotch lately? Listen to me, you little puke.
M. Rollins, Lynn Pham, and Frederick Hornsey. Between the slow trickle of sponsorship offers as well as YouTube's campaign to suppress any violent adjacent content, the patrons have become a more and more important part of funding Casual Historian. Though the previous video has been a step in the right direction in terms of views, becoming my best performing video of this year so far, YouTube saw fit to demonetize it, which is why I am so grateful to my patrons for supporting this channel. Their support allows me to rest a little easier until YouTube decides to stop kicking me in the monetizations. Over on the Patreon, we have been talking about how we should celebrate hitting various milestones, and we've come to the conclusion that we should do it by me producing a video of the patron's choice. And right now we're looking at a number of topics to choose from suggested by fans and patrons over the years, such as a video about whether the Nazis are socialists, or a video about Armenian genocide denial, completing the genocide denial trilogy, and also stuff about the Troubles. And we're also looking for additional topics. And so if you want to have a say in what we make, then join the Patreon. And although there are all sorts of benefits, I know bottom line is that for the vast majority of those who do support this and other Patreons, you're doing it because you think what I'm doing here is of value. And so I say thank you to those who have been supporting me. And if you think what I do here is of value and you have the means to do so, then I would like you to try supporting the Patreon. If you want to see more videos from me, more videos like this, you can support us there. Thank you so much. But for now, let's get back to the history. Sadiq's strategy for winning the war was to foment further disunity in the south, thus giving him the ability to Arabize and Islamicize the region by force. Just as the Mairi did, he armed anti-Dinka militias along with arming nomadic Arab tribes in the border region to raid southern lands to burn, maim, and pillage. Entire villages would be displaced, and thousands of South Sudanese would be captured and sold into slavery.
And those that did manage to make it to refugee camps would be bombarded with Islamist indoctrination with a constant loop of Quranic readings over loudspeakers.
This obstinance led to Southern politicians managing to put aside their differences just long enough to reach out to Garang and outside powers for help. In addition to arming tribal militia, Sadiq would also arm the Murahalin militia, made up of numerous Sudanese Arab tribes, as well as the Fur, which dominated the border region between Sudan and Chad, and had ties to Gaddafi's Islamic Legion. They would join the various nomadic tribes in raiding the south and selling those they kidnapped into slavery. Sadiq would use these militias as an alternative power base to the army, which had a history of overthrowing Sudanese leaders. So he diverted government resources to the militias, but this resulted in battlefield failures due to insufficiently supplied army units, as well as increased atrocities against civilians by the militias. The Dinka were the primary targets of these raids. As the rates of famine soared, the impact of these raids became more devastating. Thousands of young Dinka boys were abandoned by their families in order to reduce the number of mouths to feed. The reason boys were abandoned rather than girls is because daughters still had value in marriage deals. The Dinka still practiced a dowry custom where a family would functionally buy their son a wife by giving another family livestock in exchange for one of their daughters. This meant that every son a family had would not only cost them food to feed them, but they were also a burden on the family's wealth.
So they abandoned their sons and left them vulnerable to kidnapping and enslavement by Arab raiders.
These boys also became targets of the SPLA, who were always in need of new recruits. The United Nations would try to save the boys from becoming child soldiers by setting up refugee camps in Ethiopia along the border with Sudan. But Sadiq's government forbade the delivery of international relief to these camps through Sudanese territory, claiming they were being intercepted by the SPLA. The Reagan administration was torn between respecting the wishes of its nominal ally and relieving a humanitarian disaster that was important to one of his political constituencies, and eventually decided to deliver food to the camp through bordering countries in what became known as Operation Lifeline.
In Sadiq's defense, Garang and the SPLA had functionally turned these UN refugee camps into training and recruitment centers in what has become a long tradition of local dissident militant groups co-opting local UN operations.
The SPLA also had a penchant for violence against civilians, especially against villages they believed were aiding the militias fighting against them. This was part of an overall effort by the SPLA to push back against Khartoum. The mistreatment of Southerners in refugee camps resulted in more rallying behind the SPLA rather than the eradication of their ethnic or religious identities. They also began a counterattack on the Murahalin, seeing a string of victories in 1987, which managed to push them back, forcing them to conduct their raids on villages in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, which were outside the reach of the SPLA. When the Murahalin came to the Sudanese army for help, they refused, not wanting to help the militia seeking to displace them. In spite of this, in 1989, Sadiq would reorganize the Murahalin as the Popular Defense Forces, placing them more under his direct control, which most of his senior officers opposed, except for Brigadier General Omar al-Bashir.
As the tide began to turn in their favor, the SPLA began to change tactics, in particular being less harsh on southern populations whom they were trying to win over, and surprise, it worked.
As they began treating other Southerners better and defended them against the Popular Defense Forces and the Sudanese army, Southerners began to see them less as a Dinka army and more as a Southern army. They also began to make headway in areas outside the South due to the brutal treatment of black Sudanese by Arab militias. The SPLA mended ties with the Anyanya II in 1988, and in 1989 captured a bunch of territory, and by June they had captured all the capitals of the southern regions. With all these setbacks mounting, the army threatened to overthrow Sadiq if he didn't make peace with the SPLA. Steps had been taken to achieve this the previous year, when the DUP began secret meetings with Garang and Addis Ababa, which resulted in a second Cocoa Dam Declaration. The SPLM agreed to drop their demands for a dissolution of the government so long as Sharia law was suspended until a new constitution could be written. But when the DUP leader presented the agreement to Sadiq, he refused it, which caused the DUP to withdraw their support from the government, forcing them to coalition with the NIF. When the army threatened to overthrow him, Sadiq agreed to enter negotiations with the South, which resulted in the NIF leaving the coalition and the DUP returning.
But on June 30th, 1989, when Sadiq was on the tarmac about to fly to Addis Ababa to meet with Dr. John Garang, he, along with hundreds of other politicians and army officers, were arrested.
A clique of Muslim officers backed by the National Islamic Front orchestrated a coup and placed the leader of the Popular Defense Forces, Omar al-Bashir, in charge. Bashir was a career officer from the Ja'alin tribe north of Khartoum, who joined the army in 1960 and had fought alongside Egyptian forces in the Yom Kippur War. Bashir reinstituted military rule and broke off all negotiations with the SPLM. While al-Bashir was the true power behind the scenes, they would make the head of the National Islamic Front, Hassan al-Turabi, the face of the regime, and under their rule Sudan would become increasingly Islamist. They would pass laws outlawing apostasy along with the Draconian Public Order Act of 1991, which prohibited mixed social gatherings between men and women, along with imposing dress codes and alcohol prohibition. They would also continue Sadiq's policy of Islamization and Arabization of the South, forcibly replacing names in the South with Arabic ones. He was the architect, not the engineer, of the policies and therefore did not fully appreciate the real-world implications of what he was doing. Given his extensive network of informants and NIF loyalists across Sudan, it would be nearly impossible to imagine he did not know what was occurring under his watch. Following the Public Order Act, Hassan al-Turabi would create the Popular Arab Islamic Congress, with the intent of supplanting the Arab League, and invited representatives from terrorist organizations such as Jamaat al-Islamiyah, Hamas, al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah to meet in Khartoum. Turabi was made the chairman of the group, which received funding from both Iran and Osama bin Laden. Turabi would make Sudan a training ground for international Islamist terrorism, with bin Laden and al-Qaeda relocating there after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. Turabi went so far as to marry his niece to bin Laden and to give the bin Laden family's construction company contracts building public infrastructure. But while Turabi was turning Sudan into an Islamist terror state, the civil war raged on.
If the SPLA had been hesitant to work with Khartoum after the overthrow of Diaries, this is doubly so for the overthrow of Sadiq, and the military coup failed to reverse the loss in territory by the government.
Sudan was already on thin ice with the US when it tilted its foreign policy toward Libya and Iran, but it would absolutely torch itself by being one of the few Arab countries to support Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which saw the rest of the Arab world withdraw their support from Khartoum. This is why Turabi created the Popular Arab Islamic Congress. It also didn't help their cause when they were the only Arab state on friendly terms with Iran, who had become Sudan's primary arms supplier by 1992. On top of this, Namibia began supporting the SPLA, who would launch an offensive in Juba, Kajo Kaji, and Kaya, and captured all of western Equatoria by November. These battlefield successes would see local militias that had previously been clients of Khartoum begin making peace with the SPLA. Despite this, they had difficulty winning the support of Equatorians who still saw them as a Dinka movement.
It also didn't help that the SPLA kept oscillating back and forth between brutal repression and reconciliation with Equatorian civilians.
But the fortunes of the SPLA would begin to turn in 1991. The regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam had been dealing with its own civil war since the Derg took power in 1974. Due to Diaries' support for anti-Derg militias in Ethiopia, Mengistu supported various anti-Khartoum rebels in Sudan, including the SPLA, whose leader in Central Oregon had been operating out of Ethiopia since 1983. But after 17 years of fighting, Mengistu's regime would finally fall in May of 1991, and was replaced with a new government that was more friendly to Sudan. Not only did this cut off the SPLA's biggest supplier of arms, but it would also force the closure of its training camps, forcing the SPLA to relocate over 200,000 people back to southern Sudan.
Additionally, the new Ethiopian government handed over all of the files it had kept on the SPLA to al-Bashir, giving him plenty of intelligence to target the SPLA's operations.
As South Sudanese refugees began flooding back into Sudan, Khartoum would use incoming international relief aid to split up the SPLA, forcing them to divide their numbers by going to the various camps. However, the US, still angry at Sudan's support for Saddam, threatened to cut off aid and suggested that refugees who couldn't return to their homes be sent back to Ethiopia. But Khartoum would take advantage of the SPLA's dismay, with the Sudanese army launching attacks against their forces in the Upper Nile.
Despite the growing international hostility towards the regime in Khartoum, the SPLA's reputation didn't fare much better.
Its association with the Mengistu regime, as well as its participation in numerous atrocities in Ethiopia on behalf of it, and its reputation for recruiting child soldiers, made the US want to cut off humanitarian aid not just to Bashir and Turabi's regime, but to the south as well, and Khartoum would reignite division within the southern camp. The SPLA commanders in Nasir had secretly been in contact with the government for several months, and were trying to get commanders in other theaters to join them in a coup against Garang, likely with the promise of some kind of independence from Khartoum. But after the fall of their primary backer in Ethiopia, most commanders decided it was not the time to disrupt the movement's leadership, so they determined they would go it alone. Going into action on August 28, 1991, their radio address was re-aired on the BBC, declaring the SPLM's new goal was the independence of southern Sudan. The fighting was isolated to the White Nile region, with Garang sending a force led by William Nuon, but the Nasir forces managed to repulse the advance. Nasir commanders would lose most of their outside support when it was discovered that they were receiving arms from Khartoum.
Although the Nasir mutiny failed to overthrow Garang, it did create a big enough opening for al-Bashir to exploit.
The Sudanese army began making advances in 1992, regaining territory in Jonglei and eastern Equatoria, and after a failed assault on Juba by Garang's forces, William Nuon defected to the Nasir faction. As 1992 continued, the Nasir faction began to see more defections. In January 1992, the Nasir leaders met with Khartoum officials and came to an agreement for a referendum on the future constitutional status of the South, albeit with independence off the table. The Nasir faction also agreed to allow the Sudanese army to pass through its territory, which led many local commanders to defect, and return to Garang's faction, headquartered in Torit. Nasir's collaboration with Khartoum angered the Equatorian provinces, believing their actions were counterproductive to southern independence.
Having failed to establish credibility amongst pro-independent Southerners, they decided to get whatever support they could by exploiting anti-Dinka sentiment.
An informal ceasefire would break out in spring of 1992, when the US-led intervention into Somalia began, with Khartoum fearing they might implement a no-fly zone over Sudan. The campaign only resumed in 1994, with the Sudanese army trying to cut off the SPLA's supply lines from Uganda. Various Ugandan rebel groups had bases in Sudan with Bashir's blessing, so he called on Joseph Kony and his Lord's Resistance Army to attack the SPLA camps and cut off their supply routes from Uganda. The LRA's activities were localized but symptomatic of a larger problem. Many of Africa's borders don't make demographic sense. Drawn by European colonizers, they don't necessarily reflect geographic or ethnic realities. The result is that everyone seems to get involved in everyone else's business. Sudan's radical Islamist government supported the LRA because the LRA harassed Uganda, which backed rebels fighting in southern Sudan. The SPLA would launch a new offensive in 1995, which by the end of 1996 would see most of their gains made by Khartoum since 1992 reversed. The SPLA would form alliances with northern resistance groups as well, which al-Bashir failed to rein in due to most of these militias being Islamist in nature. These battlefield successes followed a shift in international opinion. With Khartoum becoming more internationally isolated due to becoming a state sponsor of terror, al-Bashir felt it necessary to accept any opportunity to end the civil war. Khartoum sought a separate peace with the Nasir faction, hoping it would dilute any demands for greater autonomy from the south. But around this time, efforts were being made to end the infighting between the Nasir and Torit factions. The Nigerian government hosted a series of talks in 1992, which saw the two factions agree on self-determination for the south. A second round of talks broke down in 1993 over religious issues and regional autonomy, while a third meeting in D.C. would result in the Washington Declaration, where they reaffirmed their joint support for self-determination. An economic bloc of African countries, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, began offering mediation in 1994. These meetings drafted the Declaration of Principles, which reaffirmed the right of self-determination, as well as a requirement for the Sudanese government to become democratic and secular before they would agree to cease hostilities with Khartoum. Toward the end of the year, the Umma Party would sign on to the declaration, with the National Democratic Alliance adopting them in 1995. Now, the Sudanese government had rejected these peace demands and had been relying on the support of its neighbors, Ethiopia and Eritrea, but al-Bashir's partner, al-Turabi, had allowed the National Islamic Front to continue supporting Islamist rebels in both countries. And in response to this, Ethiopia and Eritrea, along with Uganda, would begin supporting the SPLA. Khartoum, along with Zimbabwe, would try to keep the Nasir faction on its side by continuing to send funds and arms. But in February 1995, a ceasefire would be declared between the Nasir and Torit factions after the governments of Kenya, Uganda, Eritrea, and Ethiopia agreed to send them arms. In April, the Lafon Declaration was issued, which formally reunited the movement, with a handful of Nasir faction leaders refusing to submit. Khartoum would make separate deals with most of these dissident leaders, and by the late 90s, they began to exploit the disputed oil fields, which led European governments to begin siding with al-Bashir. Turabi's support for international terrorism had already put it on the bad side of the US, and was trying the patience of the Arab world. Domestic Islamists, such as the Ansar militias, began to distrust Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda when rumors spread that they were planning on assassinating Sadiq al-Mahdi. The distrust grew so much that in 1996, the Sudanese government began looking for somewhere to deport bin Laden to, with both Saudi Arabia and Jordan refusing. They also offered to hand him over to the US, but the Clinton administration didn't trust the Sudanese government. So they turned the offer down. This is ultimately why bin Laden would find his way back to Afghanistan, the only country willing to take him in. Bashir would begin a slow process of de-Islamizing the regime, starting by disbanding the Popular Arab Islamic Congress. Turabi, playing his own part in trying to repair Sudan's relationship with the rest of the Arab world, would reorganize the NIF as the National Congress Party, and began running for parliament himself in 1997.
But this was too little, too late.
Because the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya were carried out by terrorists using Sudanese passports. The Clinton administration believed that Osama bin Laden was invested in a pharmaceuticals factory in Sudan, which was rumored to be producing chemical weapons that Khartoum was using on the rebels. So on August 20th, President Clinton approved missile strikes on targets in Afghanistan and on the pharmaceutical plant near Khartoum. The attack on the USS Cole on October 12, 2000 was found to have ties to the Sudanese government in 2007 and is believed to have been in retaliation for the 1998 missile strikes.
So I'm over 4,000 words into a video about the Second Sudanese Civil War, and I've hardly mentioned Darfur at all, or the conflict, so allow me to backtrack the narrative a couple decades to catch this part of the story up to the late 90s.
Droughts throughout much of Africa in the 1970s harmed both farmers and herders in Darfur, with farms competing for shrinking sources of water, and herders competing for a smaller number of grazing sites. This was combined with the introduction of mechanized farming, which displaced many small subsistence farmers, resulting in many being unemployed and crowding into cities in search of work, which exacerbated an overall bad economic climate. Due to the isolated nature of Darfur, Khartoum didn't exercise as much influence or control in the region. Additionally, the civil war in Chad spilled over the border into Darfur, with nomadic Arab militias seeking sanctuary from Hissène Habré's regime. And since Muammar Gaddafi was involved in Chad's civil war, this inevitably meant he was involved in Sudan's as well. Because of this, Ghaffar Namairi would arm the Chadian government against Libya. But after Namairi was overthrown in 1985, the Sudanese government switched sides, supporting Gaddafi and his Arab allies in the borderland between Chad and Sudan, many of which became part of the Popular Defense Forces. When Hissène Habré took power in southern Chad, he began arming the Black Darfurians against the Arabs until he was overthrown in 1990. Some Darfurians would ally with the SPLA, with a former NIF member, Daoud Boulad, leading an SPLA force into the region, but his campaign failed, with Boulad captured and executed in January of 1992. Gaddafi supported two Arab supremacist groups in the region, the Islamic Legion and the Arab Gathering, who sought to ethnically cleanse the Sahel of African farmers and herders. The remnants of these groups were eventually reorganized as the Janjaweed militia in Sudan, with its infamous leader, Sheikh Musu Hilal. The first Darfur rebellion broke out in 1987, pitting the Arabs against the African Fur, when Arab rebels from Chad set up training camps in Darfur, with support from Gaddafi and Sadiq al-Mahdi. The Fur responded by forming the Federal Army of Darfur, or FAD, which trained 6,000 fighters to defend their villages from the hostile Arab militias. But local Arab elites asked Khartoum to help put down the FAD and provided the Janjaweed with weapons more advanced than the Fur could procure for themselves, which resulted in thousands of Fur killed and hundreds of villages looted and burned. A peace agreement from 1989 called for both FAD and the Janjaweed to be disarmed and for Chadian militias to be deported, but the government in Khartoum never enforced it. On top of this, in 1994, al-Bashir and Turabi would have the province of Darfur split into three in order to politically weaken the Fur, just as Namairi had done with southern Sudan back in 1983. The Second Darfur Revolt broke out in 1995 when the Masalit tribe revolted against Khartoum in protest of the newly arrived Arab leaders being granted the titles of Emir, placing them on par with the Masalits' traditional cultural leader, the Sultan. When fighting broke out, Khartoum sided with the Arabs, with the Ansar militias fighting against the Masalit tribe, and the Janjaweed resuming their attacks on the Fur. Another peace agreement was reached in 1999 when al-Bashir agreed to a balance of power agreement between the Masalit and Arabs, after having implemented an Arab-only policy for local councils.
At this point, we can now return to the main part of our story.
While the fighting was temporarily stopped in Darfur, and the Southerners had put aside most of their differences, we began to see infighting in Khartoum. For a decade, Omar al-Bashir and Hassan al-Turabi had competed for power in the Sudanese government, with Turabi eventually seeking an elected office in parliament. These divisions eventually resulted in the arrest of al-Turabi in 1999. Former ousted Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi had returned from exile, and the U.S. was hostile towards Khartoum over its sponsorship of terrorism and its treatment of the South. By 2001, the final major schism within the SPLA was resolved, which placed Garang in a position to seriously begin negotiations. Both the government and SPLM said they wanted a united Sudan, but both insisted that it was the other's prerogative to make that an appealing offer to the other. But 9/11 would change al-Bashir's calculations, fearing a potential U.S. invasion as happened in Afghanistan and later Iraq, especially with its own direct connections to bin Laden and al-Qaeda and numerous terrorist attacks. This was doubly concerning due to President George W. Bush being very sympathetic to the plight of Christians in Africa. Sudan had been on the president's radar screen since we first arrived in Washington. He wanted to end the decades-long civil war between the South and the North that had resulted in the death of millions of people. Evangelical Christians in the United States had long championed the cause of Christians in the African South of Sudan, who had been oppressed by Arab Muslims in the North. Prior to 9/11 and the War on Terror, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell had encouraged President Bush to make Africa a focal point of his foreign policy, with Reverend Franklin Graham putting a particular emphasis on South Sudan. In June 2001, the administration would rescind the Clinton-era policy prohibiting emergency aid to northern Sudan. On September 6, 2001, the U.S. appointed former Missouri Senator Jack Danforth as U.S. envoy to Sudan, bringing a list of 4 questions to see how serious al-Bashir was about finally ending the civil war. The message was supposed to be delivered on September 11, 2001, but other events would delay it. In July 2002, Khartoum and the SPLM signed the Machokos Protocol, which set up the broad principles for a peace agreement. Under approval from the president, Colin Powell would entice Bashir to fully commit to peace by offering to remove Sudan from the list of state sponsors of terror.
But violence was about to break out in Darfur again.
In the year 2000, the Black Book was published. A group calling itself the Justice and Equality Movement analyzed the history of independent Sudan and found 3 tribes, which represented only 5% of the population of Sudan, dominated 70% of senior positions in the government. The movement would begin distributing the book in May 2000 after Friday prayers at mosques across the country. Even Bashir himself received a copy, at which point the regime tried to buy up everyone it could find in order to prevent the dissemination of the information.
But in a phenomena we now call the Streisand effect, these efforts only increased public interest in the book.
The Third Darfur Revolt would begin in February 2002. The Fur, Zagawa, and Masalit began attacking army garrisons and looting their armories. Al-Bashir would call on the Janjaweed to put down the revolt, who proceeded to burn down Darfurian villages and massacre civilians. Fur politicians in Khartoum complained to the government about this, after which the local governors were allowed to arrest Arab and Fur militants. But the vice president, Ali Osman Taha, ordered the release of militia leader Sheikh Musa Hilal in April 2003. Khartoum would blame the local governor for the conflict. By October 2003, the rebels had overrun most of Darfur, winning most of their engagements with the Sudanese army. The Darfurian rebels were demanding a seat at the negotiation table between Khartoum and the SPLM, but Bashir feared that allowing them to do so would only encourage more rebellions in the north. And so Khartoum would enact a brutal counterinsurgency. The regime rewarded loyal tribes by giving them lands taken from rebelling tribes, which encouraged the Janjaweed to slaughter and torch more villages. As the army continued losing battles against the Darfurian rebels, they began to shift their focus to attacking civilians as well. The Bush administration would finally secure a ceasefire and a final peace agreement between Khartoum and the SPLM in January 2005, in which both sides agreed to a popular referendum to determine whether the South would remain part of Sudan or become an independent nation. The UN would send 10,000 troops to southern Sudan to ensure the peace, but in order to ensure the cooperation of the Sudanese government, both the UN and the US government had to refrain from referring to the massacres in Darfur
as genocide. John Garang would die in a plane crash in June of 2005, many suspecting foul play. And the people of South Sudan would finally get to vote for independence in 2011, becoming the newest country recognized in the UN, and would tragically fall into its own civil war in 2013. But those are all stories for another time.